Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I want to break down the Ringer's comments on the Wolves a little bit more. Are they coming around to the idea of the Timberwolves having both Rudy Gobert, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Naz Reid in the same roster? Is bigger better in the Western Conference? Talk about that a little bit. Some of the teams that it may be more important to play big against in the West this year. Plus, a few odds and ends items on Jade McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and I guess Damian Lillard. We'll get to all that here on the show today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Birddogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA or enter the promo code LockedOnNBA for a free white tech hat with any purchase. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. We promise you that. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Hope you've had a fantastic week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this one. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, along with all the other Minnesota Locked On podcasts. It's a great time to get the app with football season starting now, actually. The Vikings' first preseason game, I believe, was last night. The Gophers are going to play in a couple of weeks. Locked On Vikings, Locked On Golden Gophers, fantastic. The Twins still in first place somehow. Go ahead and download Locked On Sports Minnesota on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Again, Roku or Amazon Fire TV, look up the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today. You can also follow this show on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken. That's with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right, so I want to start today with basically what I finished the show on Wednesday with, which was the comments on the Ringer. I think it was the Bill Simmons podcast on the Ringer with Simmons and Ryan Russillo talking about the Wolves. They did an expansion draft and Josh Minett's name came up, and then there was an ensuing conversation about the Wolves. So that's what I want to focus on first. We'll get to a few random, not completely random, Timberwolves related random things towards the end of the show. On Jade McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and also there's still people that won't let the idea of a Damian Lillard trade die. Well, the idea of a trade period obviously is not dying, but potentially to the Wolves is not dying. This is a national perspective on it that I want to talk about towards the end of the show here today. But let's start with the Ringer and the Cliff Notes. The really quick version is in this fake expansion draft that Simmons and Russillo were doing. Russillo took Josh Minett. Simmons had no idea who he was. And then they had a brief discussion about, like, hey, in this scenario, in an expansion draft, the Timberwolves or every team would have to designate 8 players to protect, right? So the other 6 or 7 guys on the roster would then be available to be drafted, but only one player from each team can be selected. So that makes things a little more complicated for the teams drafting. It means each of the 2 expansion teams would get 1 player from every team, essentially, is how that would shake out. Or sorry, no, I said that wrong. Every team, the other 30 teams would all lose a player, and they would be split in 2 among the 2 expansion teams. So each expansion team would have a 15-man roster. And then undoubtedly if and when this actually happens, they would each get a draft pick. So there'd have to be some, cuts and the whole thing. But anyway, there'd be 30 rounds. And that is how they played played by the rules in the rules that they created for their fake expansion draft. So there was a brief discussion between Russillo and Simmons. Would the Wolves even protect Rudy Gobert? Would they allow him and his max salary to potentially be selected in the expansion draft? They basically said, well, no, I don't think the Wolves could do that, just to try and, because then if they did that, as Simmons says, you'd admit we made the worst trade of the last 25 years. Then Simmons goes on to say that he has a zag, and I'm gonna paraphrase what he said, and then I'll talk about why this matters. He basically says the Wolves did the best job against Denver in the playoffs, which is of course now a popular talking point. Now, I agree with it also, by the way, because if you look at Jokic's individual game scores, if you look at net ratings, all this stuff, Yes, the Suns won one more game than the Wolves, or excuse me, was it the Suns or the Suns won one more game. The Lakers were swept, and the Heat won the same number of games as the Wolves. But the Suns' losses were, I think, all blowouts, or at least 3 of the 4 were blowouts. And the Wolves only had the one blowout and were really competitive in the other 4 games for most of those games. So I think pretty objectively, the Wolves did give Denver the toughest challenge. So then he goes on to talk about how Jokic dominated the playoffs. The Wolves actually gave him a tough time, and you need big guys to go through Jokic to win the title, which now, of course, is the thing now that Jokic has actually won a title. Never mind that he was the MVP the last 2 years, right? Like, I get that it's different because Denver won the title, but Nikola Jokic was the MVP the last 2 years, and yet when the Wolves made this trade for Gobert last year, everybody laughed at them, especially Bill Simmons and also Ryan Russillo. And now suddenly, because Jokic managed to win a title, he's just as good as he was the last 2 years, right? Things broke a little bit better. He was maybe a little better in the playoffs, so the supporting cast showed up at the right moments. Aaron Gordon was great. Now all of a sudden, the trade may not be so bad for this reason. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. But hear me out. I'm gonna play this out further. He basically makes the point that between Cat, Gobert, and Naz Reid now, you have the size to challenge Nikola Jokic to make his life miserable in the playoffs. And therefore, he doesn't come out and say, like, maybe the trade made sense. But the conclusion is, as things sit right now, it's not the worst thing to have a bunch of bigs. So, I mean, take a look at the West, right? Like, take a look at the best teams in the Western Conference. Who were the top 2 seeds last year? Denver and Memphis. Memphis, they've got a pretty big guy in the middle there too, right? I mean, Steven Adams, the Wolves, he's always given the Wolves plenty of problems. So, and also, by the way, 2 years ago when the Wolves played Memphis in the playoffs, I was deathly afraid of Memphis's offensive rebounding prowess, and for good reason. That was a huge factor in the first round series. Same thing last year. Memphis finished 6th in offensive rebounding. The Wolves were 26th in defensive rebounding. So I would both agree with Simmons in that how do you combat rebounding skill and general size? Well, with more size. But on the flip side, I'm sure Simmons doesn't know this because why would he, right? Like, he's not going to be super in the weeds on I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here, but the Wolves have been a bad rebounding team for years, regardless of how big their lineup is, right? They were 26th in defensive rebounding last year. Now, of course, Cat was out a big chunk of the season, but before he got hurt, they still weren't rebounding the ball well. But you'd think with Towns at the 4 and, playing Naz Reid at the 4 some off the bench as a natural center, bumping Kyle Anderson to the 3 at times, which they will do this year, you'd think that your rebounding skill is going to go up. And also adding Rudy Gobert, the best defensive rebounder in the league several years running prior to last season. But no, the Wolves were only slightly better in terms of team ranking, and I think their actual percentage went down slightly last year, defensive rebounding. So I'm willing to say that it should be better this year just by virtue of having a healthy roster and, having a bigger roster than they did a couple of years ago and a healthier roster than they did last year. And if that's the case, then that's one way to combat offensive rebounding. And so Denver having Jokic and Memphis being a very good offensive rebounding team. You could also you could keep going here. Like the 3rd seed is Sacramento Kings. They're not a huge team, but Domantas Sabonis is a handful. And they've got other vets, guys that are, that are still good rebounders. Sacramento wasn't an outstanding offensive rebounding team by any means, but they were a good defensive rebounding team, and they still have bigs that can hurt you. Phoenix, kind of the same thing. They were a good offensive rebounding team, and Kevin Durant's a really good rebounder. It's primarily DeAndre Ayton, right? You keep on going down the list, and the Clippers and Warriors are less that way, right? Like they less have the formidable bigs. The Lakers have Anthony Davis, of course, but LeBron essentially plays power forward there most of the time. So it's a little bit of a different situation. So it stands to reason that the way you combat skilled bigs is with as many bigs as you possibly can. But it's not quite that simple, right? The pieces have to fit and the rest of the roster has to fit, and the style that you play or the actual, nuts and bolts of how you're choosing to play, the mechanics of it really matters too. So I take Simmons' point, and I think it's pretty interesting. And I think Denver, Memphis, and Sacramento being the top 3 seeds in the West, like that actually lines up pretty well with what Minnesota's done with their roster. So that makes a lot of sense to me. All right. I do want to talk a little bit about the some of these other odds and ends surrounding the Wolves, including you can see it if you're watching on YouTube. Anthony Edwards, Jade McDaniels, and Damian Lillard. We'll do that here next, and that's how we'll spend the rest of our Friday show. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Birddogs. Birddogs make you look good. Birddogs are the most comfortable shorts you'll ever wear. I promise you that. They're stretch khaki shorts. They're designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg that give you a truly sculpted look, and they're way better than regular khaki shorts that are stiff, restrictive cotton. They're better than regular athletic shorts. It's actually kind of the best of both worlds. It takes whatever good there might be in stiff khaki shorts in that they look nice, right? Birddogs look fantastic, but they feel like you're wearing basketball shorts. Today's Friday, Saturday. Whatever I do on Saturday, I'm wearing Birddogs all day. Probably run out, grab coffee, donuts, whatever in the morning, come home, hang out around the house, maybe grill out, whatever. I'm going to be wearing Birddogs. You can wear them in any situation. Like normally, if I'm wearing regular khaki shorts and I go out to the store or whatever, I come home and I put on basketball shorts, right? You put on athletic shorts because it's more comfy. With Birddogs, I literally don't do that. I'm not kidding. I wear them out. I wear them back home. I sit around the house in them because they feel like you're wearing basketball shorts. They're fantastic. You can get your own pair right now. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA or enter the promo code LockedOnNBA. You'll also get a free white tech hat, which they sent me as well. I'll wear it maybe next week. But you'll get that hat with your order by using the promo code birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA or the promo code LockedOnNBA for a free white tech hat with your Birddogs order. You won't want to take your Birddogs off. I can promise you that. A big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, everydayers will be back on Monday. We're doing Monday, Wednesday, Friday shows throughout the month of August. Plenty to talk about. There's a couple of FIBA World Cup exhibitions this weekend for Team USA. So we'll talk about Ant's performance over the weekend on Monday on that show. That'll be the primary focus then. And we're not far off from some season preview stuff. So stay tuned for all that. All right. So a smattering of odds and ends here. We're at that point of the offseason where there's just a few nuggets. There's not a whole lot else to say about them other than making sure that you hear them and giving you my take on them, because that's what we're all about. That's what the show's, that's what we do here, right? Jade McDaniels, a couple days ago, this came out. I'm sure that many people saw it. John Krasinski tweeted it out on, it might have actually been like Tuesday. The buzz this summer is that Jade McDaniels is growing, that he's now measuring around 6'11". He's 22 years old. So that news was, what was it, Ant after his rookie year? He had been listed at 6'4", and then he's now essentially 6'6". Like he just kept growing as a rookie when he was 18, 19. But Jade McDaniels turning 22 and still growing is insane. Now he's also going to play. He played almost exclusively the three last year, right? With how big the Wolves roster is and with what Chris Finch wants to do. But this think about how big this starting lineup is. I talked about this last year going into the season, and Mike Conley is not that much smaller than D'Angelo Russell. I'm going to pull up the exact height here, but I believe D'Angelo Russell was, let's see, Conley. I guess he's a little shorter, but he's also long. Like Conley's got a long wingspan. He's 6'1", but he's got a big wingspan. D'Lo is 6'4", with a solid wingspan as well. But think about the rest of the starting lineup, right? You have Rudy Gobert, you have Karl-Anthony Towns at the 4, you have Jade McDaniels, who's apparently 6'11" at the 3, and then Anthony Edwards, who's 6'6" at the 2. And then your bench, you have Naz Reid as your, you're probably, we'll talk more about rotation here as we get a little closer to the season, but the way that Chris Finch is going to handle the rotation is one of Gobert or Towns will be on the floor most of the time. Naz will have a few minutes here and there as the 5. But Naz is your backup 4 when he's naturally, albeit an undersized 5, he's naturally a 5. And then Kyle Anderson is going to play a lot more 3 because of the presence of Naz Reid and the contract that Naz Reid signs. So you're going to see a lot more Kyle Anderson at small forward, which is a topic for another day. We covered it a little bit after the moves this offseason, and I talked a little bit about how about my concerns there, because Kyle Anderson, over the course of his career, his teams have been much better with him on the floor as a power forward than him on the floor as a small forward. Of course, there's ways, Chris Finch can kind of manipulate that based on defensive assignments, et cetera, and also who's initiating offense. Because, again, not to get too off here, it's all related. It's because there's not a de facto backup point guard in the rotation, because I don't think Jordan McLaughlin's in the top 10, right? We've talked about this. Shake Milton is kind of nominally the point guard, but it could be Kyle Anderson initiating offense. It could be Anthony Edwards with the second unit. It could be Nickeil Alexander-Walker initiating some offense. So there's ways to kind of manipulate what the role actually is, even if Slow-Mo is functionally playing the three, or I guess not functionally. In name, he's playing the three, but he's functionally doing something else, right? So anyway, but the Wolves will be that much bigger, because think about it. Alexander-Walker, he's big for a two. Like, if he's essentially your backup two, Shake Milton's not huge, but decent size for a one. Like, that whole bench unit is huge. You're replacing the Taurean Prince minutes with some combination of, effectively, like, I know Kyle Anderson and Naz Reid were on the team last year, but some of the Prince minutes are going to be backfilled by those guys, right? So there's just a ton of size and length, and Jade McDaniels growing is the craziest thing, and not a development I had on my bingo card for this offseason. But exciting news nonetheless. The Ant news is, I guess, neither really, it's not positive, but it's not really unexpected. Anthony Edwards was fined by the NBA for the chair swinging incident following the playoff game in late April. The reason why it took so long, and judging by Twitter, there's plenty of folks that didn't take the time to read the press release and just were angry to be this. I've been on Twitter before, I promise, or X, sorry. I get that that's how this works, but it's still a little bit startling when, like, I think it was Shams who tweeted it, like, I think it was Shams. Literally, the press release says in it why it took so long, and people are commenting saying, "Oh, this is 4 months later." Well, the reason why is because they had to wait for the legal. Remember, he was actually there were a couple of folks trying to press charges against Anthony Edwards for admittedly carelessly swinging the folding chair. I don't even remember if I talked about this on the show, because it just seemed like it was so blown out of proportion. But the criminal case was dismissed, and I don't know exactly when or how or what happened there, but the NBA is going to fine him $50,000, which is essentially the max fine that they can offer. I get why they have to crack down, and he's not going to be suspended, which also makes sense. I get why they have to crack down. I'm not going to complain about the fine. What he did was careless. The fact that anybody tried to press charges is pretty absurd. But I understand why the league's fining him $50K, because they can't have the appearance of players swinging chairs, or they can't have players. It's just the same thing as if Steph Curry throws his mouth guard into the stands in frustration, he gets fined like $40K for that, or $35K or whatever, right? Like, that's just kind of how this works. Not a surprise. It is good to know that it's past us. It's over. There's no suspension to be worried about. And also to have it reiterated that the criminal case is buttoned up and it doesn't exist anymore. It was just I don't know. How many times has a player done something like that and then nothing comes of it? Obviously, Ant can't do it. He's got to be more careful. But, man, I would say that would have been I guess it wasn't a lawsuit, but a frivolous lawsuit. Frivolous pressing of charges is really what that seemed like to me. Okay. Let's close the show by talking a little bit about this Damian Lillard thing, which is, it is, it's one of those threads through the offseason that we go back to every, I would say, few weeks. It's been a while since we've talked about it. I want to give my thoughts on Greg Swartz at Bleacher Report's thoughts on the idea of a Dame trade, potentially to Minnesota. There is no clear rumor, to be clear, no real rumor, I should say. But it is a discussion, a trade that possibly theoretically could happen, and I think it's worth discussing. So I'll give my take on it next, and that's how we'll close the show. All right, so we all know Damian Lillard is very likely to be traded by the Portland Trail Blazers at some point. We also know the Miami Heat are the team he wants to go to, but he hasn't been traded yet. And we're a little over a month past when he requested the trade, 5 weeks or so. And yes, it feels like Miami will get him eventually, but there's other teams that could jump in, and ultimately it's not up to Dame where he goes. So even though the Blazers and Dame are saying all the right things about getting him to where he wants to be, we don't know. Anything could happen. So of course, there's still the periodic, like, hey, what teams could land him? So there's a Bleacher Report article where 4 different Bleacher Report staff members picked a team that should risk a Damian Lillard trade. The Utah Jazz are mentioned by Andy Bailey. The Sixers are mentioned by Zach Buckley. The Nets are mentioned by Eric Pincus. And your Minnesota Timberwolves are mentioned by Greg Swartz as a possible landing spot for Damian Lillard. I'm not going to read his whole, write up. It's what, like 5 paragraphs? But I'll read a chunk. He says, the Towns-Gobert frontcourt experiment should already be deemed a failure. This is Greg Swartz speaking, not me. As the Wolves were statistically better with Kyle Anderson starting over Towns and surrounded by Anthony Edwards, Gobert, Jade McDaniels, and Mike Conley Jr., a plus 7.6 net rating compared to a plus 5.8 rating. Let's stop right there. I get what Greg's doing here. It's irresponsible. It just is. Towns and Gobert started, what is it, 28 games together, 26 games together, 27, somewhere in there. And that, it's not like they were a minus 10 or even a minus 4 or a minus anything. They were still a plus 5.8. And with Kyle Anderson starting over Towns, they were a plus 7.6. Yes, that matters. And we're talking net rating every point and a half. Like it really does matter. But that is such a small difference when the sample size is far skewed in Kyle Anderson's favor. It's, I think, like I said, irresponsible to cite that and be like, oh, there's a reason you should trade Karl-Anthony Towns. It seems crazy. It's not a failure. You had a positive net rating, and they didn't even have time to really gel together. And also, how often was Mike Conley? Mike Conley wasn't part of the first 11 games of the season when those guys were together. He wasn't on the team then. So you have an even smaller sample. I guess I could have pulled up the exact games in minutes, but we've talked about it before. Like the sample is very, very small. And so to just kind of throw it out there, it's just kind of like, that's one of the talking points, right? Is that it's a failure. He goes on to talk about how there need to be a third team involved because Portland probably doesn't want Towns, which we heard around the draft when the Wolves reportedly were exploring the possibility of trading Towns for the pick that became Scoot Henderson. That was never 100% confirmed, but there were reports out there. I think actually Bleacher Report had one of them that the Wolves weren't interested and the Blazers weren't interested, but the idea, apparently they talked at some point, right? I don't think the Blazers would want Towns. I do agree with that. And so what Sports pitches here is that Atlanta could be your third team. The Hawks could send out plenty of different guys, whether it's Sadiq Bey, DeAndre Hunter, etc. Kobe Buffkin, this year's rookie. They have tons of first-round picks. Well, actually not tons because they traded a bunch of the DeJounte Murray trade, right? So he's basically saying Towns could go to Atlanta, form a big three with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, and then Lillard would join the Timberwolves core in Minnesota. Portland gets picks, basically, and then and players from Atlanta. It makes sense from a basketball standpoint. Functionally, it does. It's not going to happen, right? Like the Wolves are not going to trade Karl-Anthony Towns for Damian Lillard. Lillard, first of all, doesn't want to be. It's not a slight against Minnesota. He doesn't want to be in Minnesota. He wants to be in Miami. So I don't think that's going to happen. I also don't love the Dame Ant fit. And I know beggars can't be choosers. And in general, the idea is like get as many superstars on a team as you can. And I get that to a point. But it doesn't always work out, right? Like, I don't know, the Gobert Towns thing, which he starts the article talking about how it doesn't work. The fit doesn't work. Why would you take the Gobert Towns pairing and say this isn't working after 28 games together, only half of which included Mike Conley, and then say, let's stick Lillard and Ant in the same backcourt? I get it. It's a little different, right? Because Ant's a plus defender. Well, oh, wait, so's Gobert, right? Both are good offensive players. Sure. Both can shoot threes, but like, I don't know. What's the best way to say this, right? I think that's actually a pretty good way to frame it. But think about it this way. Like D'Lo and Ant didn't work in the backcourt. I know Dame is way better than D'Angelo Russell. I know that. I'm not at all suggesting that D'Lo is anywhere near as good as Damian Lillard in any way, shape, or form. However, they're similar point guards in their shoot first point guards. They need the ball in their hands. They're ball dominant. Dame is far better than D'Angelo Russell. So would the Wolves be good with Dame and Ant in the backcourt? Absolutely, they would be. Would they be significantly better than the fully realized healthy version of the team currently that includes Rudy Gobert and Karl-Anthony Towns? I don't know. I don't know that they'd be significantly better. Because when Dame's shooting, Ant's not shooting. When Ant's shooting, Dame's not shooting. And then you still have Rudy Gobert, who's going to want the ball, and you still have Jade McDaniels, and you still have, other pieces that are going to want to be involved. There'd also have to be other, the Wolves would need another big at somehow in this trade. Like, it's not mentioned here, but maybe Onyeka Okongwu comes to Minnesota or something, right, from Atlanta. There'd have to be another big coming to Minnesota, because otherwise now suddenly you have a thin front court. I just don't think that's a very synergistic pairing. The backcourt is Ant, so you need a lower usage guy that can defend. Enter Mike Conley, right? Like, he's the perfect type of guard. I know he's old. I know he slipped a little defensively, but he looked pretty dang good in the Timberwolves uniform at the end of last season. So I think that's the type of point guard you want next to Ant. Or maybe it's a dynamic passer that can still initiate offense and get Ant the ball in advantageous positions to score. But you don't want a ball dominant guy that's going to take a ton of shots away from Ant. Even if it's Dame, I just don't love that fit. And I know that there's been teams that have tried to prove this wrong and kind of have, like, go all the way back to the big three in Miami, the original big three with LeBron and Dwayne Wade. You could go to what the Clippers have tried to do with Paul George and Kawhi, which has worked when they're healthy. But there aren't that many examples of high usage backcourt guys playing together and being successful. It's just a tough thing to do. I'm not suggesting that Ant couldn't do it or that he wouldn't want to do it. I'm not saying that about Dame. I just think where the Wolves are right now makes a lot more sense than swapping out Towns for Damian Lillard. I just that's where I'm at. And I don't see this happening anyway, because Dame doesn't want to do it. The Wolves don't want to punt on the Towns-Gobert pairing yet. Maybe if somehow something hasn't happened and the Wolves have a tough first half of the season, maybe it's a trade deadline conversation and it comes back up. I could see that. I'm not saying it would never happen. I just don't think it's likely. And especially this timing, this late in the offseason, after everything the Wolves have been through and talking about keeping, Towns and keeping the core and all that stuff. I just don't think it's going to happen. All right. That's all we got for you today. Monday, we're going to talk FIBA World Cup. Ant's back in action this weekend. We'll talk about, I believe they play both Friday and Saturday. So that'll be a big focus of Monday's show. We'll see you then, of course, Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week again, as we're doing throughout the month of August. A big thank you to those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find this one. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Also, you can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.